When most people think of medieval warfare, they imagine shining armor, honorable duels, and heroic knights charging across open fields. It's the stuff of legends, movies, and fairy tales. But the truth behind those romanticized stories is far more brutal, chaotic, and disturbing. Medieval war wasn't about chivalry. It was about survival in some of the harshest and most unforgiving conditions imaginable. The battlefield was dirty, disease-ridden, loud, and terrifying. Weapons didn't just wound, they shattered bones and tore bodies apart. And even if you weren't fighting, just being there could get you killed. The reality of medieval combat was a nightmare few modern people truly understand. Let's take a closer look at why war in the Middle Ages wasn't just bad. It was far worse than you probably think. Number 1, no glory in the mud. When people think of medieval warfare, they tend to picture cinematic scenes. Knights in polished plate armor gleaming under the sun, charging across green fields with banners flying and trumpets sounding. That version is pure fantasy. The actual conditions on a medieval battlefield were far more brutal, dirty, and miserable than most can imagine. The truth is, many of these battles took place in fields that had been churned into mud pits by days of rain and the movement of thousands of feet, hooves, and wheels. There were no roads, no solid ground, just thick, sticky earth that clung to everything. Soldiers didn't march confidently into battle. They slogged, slipped, and stumbled, often weighed down by armor already soaked through and covered in grime. Even before any swords were swung or arrows loosed, soldiers were exhausted simply by trying to move. Footing was unreliable. You could be running 1 second, then flat on your back the next, unable to rise because your legs were caught in mud and your armor dragged you down like an anchor. Horses, which many knights relied on for mobility, were not immune either. They sank into soft ground, panicked, or fell outright. A fallen knight could easily be trampled, suffocated in muck, or finished off while helpless. There are accounts of entire units bogged down in marshy terrain, becoming easy targets. Weapons malfunctioned in these wet, filthy conditions. Bows lost tension. Crossbows jammed. Blades dulled faster when they hit mud instead of flesh. And then there was the stench. An overwhelming mix of rotting animal carcasses, unwashed bodies, blood, and sewage. Without drainage systems, fields turned into open cesspools. Combatants didn't just fight for victory, they fought not to vomit. Glory? There was none. Just the slow, crushing realization that the land itself could kill you before the enemy ever laid a hand on you. Number 2, gear that crushed you. The romantic image of a knight in shining armor often leaves out one crucial fact. That armor felt like walking around with a grown man strapped to your body. A full suit of plate armor typically weighed between 40 and 60 pounds, and though designed to distribute that weight fairly evenly, it didn't change the reality. It was like wearing a furnace that clanked with every step. Movement was restricted. Vision was limited. Breathing became harder once the visor came down. And if the sun was out, it turned that steel shell into a personal oven. Heatstroke wasn't just possible, it was a constant threat. Sweat soaked the padded garments underneath, and without proper ventilation, dehydration followed quickly. But knights weren't the only ones dealing with unbearable gear. The common infantryman had it just as bad, sometimes worse. Chainmail might have been more flexible than plate armor, but it was still heavy and offered far less protection. Over that, many wore thick gambesons, quilted jackets stuffed with layers of cloth or wool, to cushion against blows. Now, layer that with a helmet, shield, weapons, and supplies, and you're looking at someone carrying upward of 70 to 80 pounds. That's before factoring in long marches or uneven terrain. Every step was a strain on the knees, every hill a personal war before the real one began. And the fatigue? It was bone deep. Marching for hours across unforgiving landscapes, sleeping on the ground, then rising at dawn to prepare for battle didn't allow your body to recover. There were no breaks. Once the fighting began, you were expected to swing, block, and survive, often while soaked in sweat and gasping for air. If you fell during combat, the weight could pin you to the ground. Getting back up was not guaranteed, especially under attack. The gear that was meant to protect you often became the very thing that sealed your fate. Number 3. Medical help was a joke. Wounds on the battlefield were only the beginning of a soldier's suffering. If you were cut, stabbed, or bashed in the ribs with a mace, your chances of proper treatment were close to zero. There were no antiseptics, no concept of germs, and certainly no anesthesia. The pain didn't just stay with you, it took over everything. Field surgery was as primitive as it gets. Most of the time, the man treating you wasn't even a real doctor. He was likely a barber or a butcher who had some experience cutting flesh and sawing through bone. Amputations were common, done with rusty blades and usually without anything stronger than some alcohol to dull the agony. Infections set in fast. Dirt and blood mixed together in deep gashes, and without clean water or sterile bandages, even a simple cut could swell, rot, and turn black. Gangrene meant the limb was gone, or you were. Some soldiers were dragged to filthy tents or barns turned into makeshift infirmaries where they lay moaning among the dying, flies buzzing around open wounds. If they were lucky, they passed out from the pain. If they weren't, they lived long enough to feel their body betray them, slowly and painfully, with no real help coming. Number 4. Siege warfare was pure hell. The idea of holding a castle against an invading force might sound noble, but in practice, it was a slow, horrifying nightmare that pushed people to their limits and beyond. Once an enemy army surrounded your walls, the clock started ticking. Not toward victory, but toward slow starvation. Supply lines were cut, water sources poisoned or blocked, and the food stored inside quickly ran out. People began by rationing. Then they ate whatever they could find. Moldy grain, roots, rats, and eventually things far worse. Desperation didn't care about dignity. In extreme cases, even the unthinkable became real. Cannibalism among the weakest. Disease flourished inside cramped stone walls. With no working sewage system and far too many bodies packed into one place, filth piled up fast. Waste mixed with drinking water. Infections spread like wildfire. You could be perfectly healthy when the siege began and barely clinging to life weeks later, without ever seeing a sword raised against you. Meanwhile, outside, the attackers weren't just waiting around. They were constantly building siege towers, digging tunnels to collapse walls, or firing projectiles designed to terrorize. Burning pitch, diseased carcasses, or worse. And when the gates finally gave way, mercy vanished. Civilians, defenders, the elderly, it didn't matter. What followed was often a brutal slaughter without distinction. Number 5. The noise was deafening. Step onto a medieval battlefield, and the first thing that hits you isn't the sight of armored men charging, it's the sheer, unrelenting noise. It crashes over you like a wave and doesn't stop. There's no moment of calm, no dramatic pause before combat begins. Instead, it starts with the beat of war drums echoing through the air, followed by the rising roar of voices, soldiers shouting orders, men screaming battle cries, others already crying out in fear or pain. Then come the metallic crashes, sword against shield, axe on helmet, mace crushing bone. These aren't clean, elegant sounds. They're brutal, sharp, and terrifying. Horses scream as they're stabbed or stumble. Siege weapons rumble like thunder, hurling massive stones that explode against walls or towers. When catapults strike, the ground shakes. Arrows don't just fly, they hiss and snap as they rip through the air in massive volleys. If you're lucky, you hear them. If not, they find you before you even know they were released. The moans of the wounded blend with the shouting, turning everything into a deafening chaos that never lets up. There's no chance to think, no moment to catch your breath. The volume drowns out commands, scatters formations, and shatters your sense of control. It wasn't just the enemy that wore men down, it was the unrelenting storm of sound that followed them long after the battle was over. Number 6. You could die without even fighting. Long before a soldier ever faced the point of a spear or the edge of a blade, he was already locked in a daily battle for survival and the enemy was everywhere. Disease crept silently through medieval camps, striking with no warning and no mercy. The conditions were a perfect storm for sickness. Soldiers lived packed together under makeshift tents, sleeping on damp ground exposed to the elements and surrounded by filth. Hygiene was nearly non-existent. Water sources weren't separated from waste, so men drank the same water where others washed, bled, or relieved themselves. That alone guaranteed outbreaks of dysentery and cholera, which could kill within days. Food was no safer. Rations spoiled quickly in the heat or went moldy in the cold. What little meat they had was often undercooked or crawling with parasites. One bad meal could lead to violent sickness, leaving a man too weak to stand, if it didn't kill him outright. And then there were the pests. Lice burrowed into clothing, fleas jumped from man to man, and rats scurried across sleeping bodies at night. All of them spread disease like wildfire. Even in the Crusades and major campaigns, illness claimed far more lives than swords ever did. Armies could lose half their strength without ever meeting the enemy. You didn't have to step on the battlefield to die, you just had to be there, breathing in the same rancid air, hoping your body could hold out longer than the rot surrounding you. Number 7. Psychological torture was real. Standing shoulder to shoulder in the thick of a medieval battlefield, knowing that death could come screaming at you in seconds, was a mental test few could truly endure. Picture the ground trembling as a wall of armored warriors charges straight at you. Their war cries grow louder with every step, weapons raised, eyes locked. You can't run. Turning your back would mean being cut down instantly. There's no safe place to hide, no chance to pause. Your armor rattles against your chest with every nervous breath, and the man beside you can barely hold his spear steady. In that moment, your entire body is screaming to flee, but your mind is trapped, frozen under the weight of sheer terror. The brutality didn't end after the clash. Survivors carried the horror with them long after the battlefield was quiet. Soldiers who lived through the chaos often became haunted by it. They'd wake up soaked in sweat, screaming from nightmares of friends dying beside them or of foes they'd killed up close. Sudden rage, mood swings, numbness, signs of trauma we now recognize as PTSD, were brushed off as weakness. There was no treatment, no understanding. You were just expected to return to your village or to the next war and act like it never happened. But the fear didn't leave. The screams echoed long after the steel had stopped ringing. Number 8, your own side could kill you. In the madness of medieval combat, death didn't always come from across the battlefield. Sometimes it came from the very people meant to protect you. Friendly fire was far from a rare occurrence. It was a constant risk. Archers fired arrows in massive waves, often without any clear line of sight. Their job wasn't precision, it was volume. Once those arrows left the string, they didn't care who they hit. If your unit moved too far forward or too slow, you could end up right in their path. A single misstep in formation and you'd feel a shaft burying into your back. Not from the enemy, but from your own ranks. Chaos ruled the battlefield. Visibility was often destroyed by dust, fog, or smoke from fires and cannons. Identifying friend from foe in the middle of that storm was nearly impossible. Helmets covered faces, armor styles looked similar, and once the fighting turned into a close-quarters frenzy, soldiers struck anything that moved. Mistakes weren't just likely, they were expected. But even worse was the pressure from commanders. If you hesitated, faltered, or fell out of line, it could be seen as cowardice. There was no tolerance for fear. Officers sometimes executed their own men on the spot for retreating without orders, trying to make an example. Discipline was brutal, and mercy wasn't part of the equation. The enemy in front of you was dangerous, but the ones behind you could be just as deadly. Number 9, training was inconsistent at best. Medieval armies were a chaotic mix of skill levels, and while the elite knights spent years perfecting their craft through sparring, hunting, jousting, and rigorous physical training, the majority of soldiers had nothing close to that kind of preparation. Most were simple peasants, farmers, blacksmiths, laborers, men who had never held a sword in their lives until they were summoned to fight. There was no formal system in place to train them. They weren't drilled, they weren't conditioned, and they weren't mentally prepared for the horrors of war. Often they were handed a spear or a dull axe, given minimal instructions, and pushed to the front lines with the vague command to follow whoever looked like they knew what they were doing. This lack of consistency in training led to complete disorder once battle began. When formations broke down, and they often did, it turned into a mess of pushing, screaming, and desperate swinging. Units fell apart quickly, not because men were weak, but because they had never been taught how to hold their ground under pressure. Coordination was a luxury most armies didn't have. Even knights with all their training suffered when commands were unclear or leadership failed. Tactics often gave way to chaos, and in many cases, battles were lost not through courage or cowardice, but through sheer confusion. Number 10. Prisoners were treated horribly. Being captured during medieval warfare wasn't a stroke of luck. It was often a sentence to something far worse than death. For knights and nobles, there was at least the slim hope of ransom. Wealthy captives were seen as valuable assets, sometimes treated with a shred of decency while negotiations played out. But for the average soldier, especially peasants or conscripts, capture meant humiliation, suffering, and usually a brutal end. There were no prisoner of war camps with meals and medical care. Instead, you were stripped of your weapons, dignity, and often your life. Very slowly. Torture wasn't rare, it was expected. Captors would beat, burn, or maim prisoners just to extract information, even if they had none to give. Fingers cut off, tongues removed, eyes gouged out. These weren't acts of rage, they were deliberate methods of intimidation. Others were used as entertainment, tied to posts and turned into living targets for archery practice or sword testing. Some were forced to fight their own people, pushed into battle under threat of death if they refused. And during crusades or religious wars, mercy was even less common. Surrender didn't guarantee safety. Entire groups were slaughtered despite begging for their lives. In that world, captivity wasn't a way out. It was another battlefield, one where the suffering had no rules and no end. Number 11, it never ended. For the medieval soldier, war wasn't a chapter in life. It was the entire book. Battles didn't come and go with clear beginnings or neat endings. Conflicts dragged on endlessly, often over generations. The 100 Years' War, for example, wasn't one long clash, but a series of campaigns, truces, and renewed fighting that spanned lifetimes. A man might be born during one phase of the war, come of age in another, and die before it ever reached any resolution. There was rarely a sense of closure, only the constant threat that the next campaign was just around the corner. Even in times labeled as peace, the violence didn't stop. Local feuds between nobles erupted into skirmishes. Border raids were common. Armed men marched not only under royal banners but also for personal revenge, unpaid debts, or ambition. Villages were burned as warnings. Crops were stolen or trampled. Families vanished overnight. If a soldier managed to return home, he might find nothing waiting. His land claimed by another, his loved ones scattered or worse. For mercenaries, the line between war and crime was thin. They lived by the sword, moving from one conflict to the next, plundering for survival. They didn't know peace, only the cycle of violence. War in the medieval world wasn't a passing event. It was a way of life, etched into the soil and the minds of everyone who lived through it.